Hi, I'm Lisa Fox with the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations, and I'm here with my colleagues, Mary Louise Hemmener and Phil Strain, for a short discussion about the return to school for young children and the considerations related to the pandemic. So as we think about the return to the classroom after many children were at home and not enrolled in services or receiving virtual or hybrid services, here's some of the things we know. In two studies in pediatrics published early in the pandemic, parents reported how the pandemic was affecting their young children. In one study, they looked at hourly service workers who reported that they had daily negative mood increases and increased hardships. And then the greater the hardships, the greater the impact on family well-being. So families who had multiple hardships had more negative moods, worse sleep, and reported more uncooperative behavior in their children. In another study, 27% of families reported their mental health had been worsened and their child's problem behaviors had intensified. In that study, the effects were greatest with parents of young children. At the University of Oregon, they did a weekly survey of 2,400 families with young children during the pandemic, including young children with disabilities. So these investigators, Dr. Phil Fisher and his team, found that in households, families who had children with disabilities, they reported greater stress, including greater child behavior problems and child anxiety. The rates of food insecurity was really high, with 28% of families saying they were food insecure. Rates of hunger were higher for Black and Latinx families, single parent families, and households of families, including children with disabilities. And in those families who experienced hunger, there were higher levels of behavioral issues, with children with families reporting that they were fussier or they were more defiant. They noted fearfulness and anxiety in their children. So I think these data, along with the data that we just know around preschool enrollment and engagement in services, indicate that we should think really carefully about how best to support children as they return to the classroom. Thinking about what child instructional practices are most important and how do program leaders best support staff in meeting the needs of young children and their families. So in our discussion, we will be referencing the social, emotional, and behavioral practices that are a part of the pyramid model for promoting social emotional competence in young children. And this approach for implementing PBIS is being used in 32 states within a variety of programs. So within early childhood special education, public preschool programs, Head Start, childcare programs. As we talk, we will highlight some of the important and pivotal social, emotional, and behavioral practices that will promote social emotional skills and prevent challenging behavior. So we only have a short amount of time. I do want to note that we have a resource that provides guidance on these practices with embedded hyperlinks that will provide some additional implementation materials I think you will find really helpful. I think our major message here in a short discussion is that we have to be ready. We have to be ready to connect with each and every child and their family, build strong relationships, help children feel safe and secure, and strengthen the social emotional skills that children need to be members of a group, to build friendships with peers, and to engage in learning.
So as we think about the things that Lisa just talked about, and as we've been thinking about the return to school, I think there are some considerations that have guided our thinking in how we get ready for children. So Lisa just said we have to be ready for children. And so what do we have to think about in terms of being ready for children? So the first thing we've been thinking a lot about is that children are going to have big emotions about coming back to school. And those big emotions might be, I'm so excited to get back to school. And they might be, I'm scared to go to school, or I'm anxious about going to school, or I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to be with other kids. And we have to be ready for all of those emotions. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about schedules and routines and why consistent and predictable schedules and routines are going to be important for children, because we know that whether they've been in virtual school or whether they've been in some other group care setting, that the schedule of the day and the routines of the classroom are going to be different than what they've experienced for the last year and a half. And then the other thing we've been thinking a lot about is that a lot of children have not been around other children during COVID, or they've only been around their siblings. And so what does that mean in terms of how we support children as they come back to school? The one other thing that I would like to just add related to this, what we're talking about today, is that a lot of teachers, especially kindergarten teachers, are going to be worried about catching children up or about children being ready academically. And we want to just emphasize that really the things that are on this slide and the pivotal practices that we're going to talk about today are the things that we need to be worried about in the first 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of school. If we do these things well, we're going to have children who are more engaged, we're going to have fewer problem behaviors, and ultimately that's really going to give us more time to teach. So we think it's really important to focus on these and know that these will create opportunities for us to support children's early academics after those first 2 or 3 weeks of school. So we're going to talk about these 3 sets of pivotal practices. And the first one is really about building relationships. And for many, many children, adults are really reinforcing. They're a powerful tool. It's something we carry around with us, right? We are an adult. We have that opportunity to engage with children. And we know that these relationships are going to be critical to children being successful in school. We know these relationships are going to be important to children feeling safe, to children feeling like they can try new things, for children feeling like they have support they need in the academic setting. I think in addition to helping children feel safe, we need to be ready for children to have a hard time, and we need to be able to support them through that. So you're going to hear me talk, and you've already heard Lisa talk a lot about being ready. And I think we need to be ready by knowing that kids are going to have big emotions, by knowing that kids are not going to know the schedule and routine, by knowing that children are going to have problem behaviors, and doing everything we can to support children and prevent those behaviors. And the ways that we interact with children around relationship practices are going to be key to that. So when we talk about relationship practices, we're talking about things that everybody knows about. We are talking about supportive conversations. We're talking about positive time and attention. We're talking about positive descriptive feedback. And we could talk a lot about what those are and how you do those. But the important thing for this webinar, and especially given our time, is really to focus on the need for all children to get these, and to think about, I think often we assess teacher practice and we say, yeah, teachers are doing these things, they know how to do these things, but that doesn't mean that they're doing them with every child. And I think one of the things that we need to support teachers to do as children are coming back to school is how we help teachers monitor their interactions to ensure that they're doing these positive practices with all children. So we see this as a prevention, and we also know that children who have problem behavior, children who are more assertive, get more attention. And one of the things we want to be careful about is that those children who are more internalizing, quiet, shy kids are getting that attention, these practices, but also that children are getting these practices or getting positive attention, having positive interactions with adults, getting positive feedback before they engage in challenging behavior, because we know that if we do these practices well with children, they're less likely to engage in challenging behavior. One of the things we often talk about with positive attention and positive feedback for children is this 5-to-1 ratio, that you need to do 5 positives for every negative kind of neutral interaction you have with a child. And is that a magic number? Maybe, but what's really important about it is that we're conscious that that we have to spend more time in positive interactions with children than in neutral or negative interactions with children in order to prevent problem behavior or to help children feel safe and secure. You can think about the one bad thing a teacher said to you today that you still remember from years ago, or you can remember the one bad grade you got, or you can remember the one bad evaluation you got when you were doing some kind of training. So just remember that one negative needs a lot of positives to counter it. And we need to think about that as it relates to each and every child in the classroom. The next thing we want to talk a bit about is this notion of providing predictability. So I would venture to guess that one of the things that has been kind of persistent in all of our lives over the last year and a half is a lack of consistency and a lack of predictability and a lack of knowing what's coming next. And so we know that for children, one of the things we're going to need to do is make sure that we create an environment where they know what to do, they know when to do it, it's consistent, it's predictable, they're engaged in the routines and the expectations of the classroom. And in order to do that, we've got to be really clear about what the schedule is and what the routines are and what the expectations are and how we're going to teach children to do those things. When we're thinking about routines and schedules, I think a big issue is going to be that for children who are coming back to school, meaning children who have been in school prior and are coming back, routines might look really different because of COVID than they looked the last time children were in group care settings. And the routines and the schedule are clearly going to be different than what they were when they were in virtual learning. So the first thing we think about in order to think about creating consistency and predictability is how we build our classroom schedule, not just how we design the schedule. And of course, we can't talk about that in any length today, but the fact that we need to have a predictable schedule, that once we know what the schedule is, that we are teach the children the schedule. Don't just assume that if we do it in the same way every day, children are going to learn it, but be intentional about how we teach children the schedule. Think about that as being a goal for the first week or two of school, is teaching children the schedule. What happens now? What happens next? What comes next? As we think about teaching children this schedule, we need to think about how to teach them for what to do when there's going to be a change in the schedule. So what do we do on days when it rains? We can't go outside, or what on some days we go to music class and on other days we don't go to music class. Being intentional about preparing children for changes. And then the last thing I want to say about schedules is the importance of knowing from day one that we're going to have to individualize. There are going to be some children with disabilities, children who have had more chaos in their families, any number of children who are going to need more support to learn this schedule. That might mean they need more prompting. It might mean they need more individualized visuals. It might mean that they just need more support during the routines. And then the other thing I encourage people to do is really think about how you can work with families to build schedules and routines around coming to and leaving school. In addition to thinking about the schedule, how we teach children what happens across the day, we also want to teach them the expectations and routines within an activity. So there's the routine that happens when you come to school first thing in the morning. What do you do? What are the expectations? How do you do it? So we also want to create structure within routines and activities across the day. And a couple of things I think we want to be really careful about in routines is individualizing, just as I already talked about, and then also building opportunities for peer interactions into routines. So children begin to get support around working with and helping their peers. And then we want to have a really clear set of behavior expectations, what we expect children to do related to behavior. So they can be things like be safe and be responsible, be a team player. But whatever our expectations are, again, we need to be sure that we're not just telling children the expectations, but we're teaching them, and we're giving children lots of opportunities to practice them and get feedback. All right, the next thing that we really want to focus on a lot those first few weeks of school, actually we'll be working on it the whole school year, is promoting social emotional competency. And why is this really important now? It's really important for all the reasons we've already talked about, that children are going to have big emotions. They're not going to have had a lot of experience with other children, and they're coming into a new routine after a long time of being away. And then the last thing is that we really want to think about teaching social skills and emotional competencies as a prevention for challenging behavior. So what do we teach? We teach friendship skills, right? We don't want to assume that children are going to know how to interact with their peers. We don't want to assume that children are going to know what to do when their peers won't play with them. We can't expect children to know how to play with their peers if we don't teach it. So we want to be really intentional about teaching peer interaction skills. Probably, as you've heard me say, I've talked a lot about emotions today, and I think that we need to be ready for kids to have these big emotions, and we have to be thoughtful about how we can make this transition to school easier for children. So for children who are scared or excited or anxious, how can we make school easier for them? Well, we can do that by doing things like offering them choices and routines. We can do that by reducing expectations. So if it's cleanup time, they don't have to clean up a whole center. They can just clean up what they've been playing with. We can check in daily or regularly throughout the day with children about their emotions, and we can provide additional support for children within routines when they need it. The other thing we need to be really conscious about is responding to children's strong emotions in a productive way. And what I mean by that is when children cry or scream or take a toy from another child or have a meltdown, our first goal should be to be curious about why they're doing that. What's the meaning of that behavior? Are they scared? Do they not know what to do? Do they not know how to do it? Are they frustrated? And then respond to them in a way that supports them to engage in behaviors related to that emotion in a more appropriate way. So think about responding to difficult emotions through a posture of supporting the child. We're going to work with children around calm down strategies and relaxation skills. And I think one of the big things about this that I often think about is how I hear teachers and families and caregivers say to children, you need to calm down, you need to relax. But 3, 4, and 5-year-old children don't know what it means to calm down or what it means to relax. And so again, you're going to hear me say this over and over again, we have to be sure we're teaching them those skills, that we're modeling those skills, and that we're giving them feedback when they engage in those skills in appropriate ways. We're going to teach children how to manage strong emotions. We're going to teach children what to do when you're scared, angry, what to do when you're frustrated, what to do when your emotions are really high. And one of the ways that we do that is through the turtle technique, which really helps children stop and think about what they're going to do before they do it, which we know is a really important self-regulation strategy. And then finally, we're going to teach children how to be good problem solvers. I can guarantee you that in the first few weeks of school, there are going to be social problems. Children are going to fight over toys. Children are going to not want to play with another child. Children are going to want to play and not know how to play. And again, I think we need to be ready, and we need to think about what are the solutions that we want children to be using, and how are we talking about those solutions in our everyday interactions with children. How are we teaching them to use those solutions? Again, we're trying to prevent social interaction issues by teaching children how to do it more appropriately. The last thing I want to talk about is that we don't wait to teach these things when problem behavior happens. So if you think about kind of a cycle here, you can think about if a child, Phil, for example, has trouble engaging with other children, don't wait for him to have a problem with that. Before the activity, help him practice his skills for initiating to other children. And then when it's time to do those, to play with other kids, help him, support him to enter that play in an appropriate way. But what we often see in classrooms is that teachers wait until Phil has a problem behavior or has problems initiating to peers. And at that time, when everybody's kind of upset, that is not a teachable moment. And so what we want people to do is be thinking about, how do I teach Phil and really all kids at these times when emotions aren't escalated, at times when you have time to support the child to practice? How do we support the child in context? And hopefully if we do those things, we don't have as much problem behavior. So I'm going to end there. But one of the things I want to say, just as I hand it off to Phil, is that just as children are going to have big emotions, and just as children are experiencing change, the adults who are supporting those children are too. And we want to talk a little bit about how to support them. Phil.
Thank you, Mary Louise. The last important message that we have to share with our leadership colleagues is this, and that is that it's not possible to maximize relationships, to maximize routines and predictability, to maximize social competence if we as adults are pouring from an empty vessel. And the corollary to that is that the best evidence that we have right now is that a lot of us and a lot of our colleagues are going to show up for work this August and September running on empty. Why do I say that? We know from national surveys that approximately 7 out of 10 adults in the U.S. report that the last 18 months has been the worst time of their adult life. Similarly, 6 out of 10 adults report that when they go to work, they feel anxious. That's the evidence that we have. The question, and hopefully some of the ideas that we have to share that you'll find useful, are that they're real things that program administrators and leaders can do to address that reality. First, we can provide the time and the space to maximize planning like we've never planned before, with a primary emphasis on that planning around maximizing learning outcomes for children. We would argue that the first content area to focus on, again, is social and emotional skills. It's also going to be important to deliver the message as leaders, again, that now more than ever, job one, not the only job, but job one, the initial job, is a laser focus on teaching social and emotional skills. Leaders also need to be focused on staff wellness. Again, perhaps like we've never been focused on staff wellness before. Perhaps we need to think about individualized plans for all the folks that we supervise around their wellness. Perhaps we need to think about creating an environment when people are at work, they have opportunities to eat more healthily than they have previously, to exercise, to actually relax during the course of the work day. We also need to provide time and space, not just once, not just in August, not just in September, for people to express their concerns through surveys, through open agenda meetings, to problem solve, to share issues, to share successes. And we need to promote intimate connections with families. These intimate connections focused on not just for the purpose of connecting, but for the purpose of maximizing children's engagement in developmentally relevant activities across environments and to maximize predictability as children transition from home to school and back to home again. And finally, we need to pre-plan. We need to engage in the expectations that there are going to be inevitable gaps in attendance, especially if we live and work in environments with low inoculation rates. It's inevitable that that's going to happen, and we need to get in front of that issue. Besides these sort of strategies, we would also argue that there's an important disposition, if you will, for administrators to model and to promote. We might call it, for example, living in a state of grace around dealing with COVID Part 2. What does that look like? What are the operational definitions of living in a state of grace? We would argue that first it's about having a positive intent about each other's behaviors. Some of us may not behave at our best. I, for one, would like for people to assume that I'm having a skill deficit in the moment. I'm not being willfully oppositional. We should also assume a stance of support, that we need support for ourselves and that our colleagues and our supervisees need support. Whether they express that need or not, let's make an assumption that that's in place. And that 5-to-1 ratio around adult-child interactions, it applies to interactions between adults as well. Let's practice that. Fourthly, it's important, again, we believe, to interpret challenging behavior in this context as a skill deficit, like we appropriately do with young children, to apply that to each other. That's an important concept around living in a state of grace. And then finally, we need to model and create the conditions under which it's a cool thing to ask for support. It's not a sign of weakness. To the contrary, it's a sign of strength. I want to end by saying that the three of us, and I'm sure it's not just the three of us, we're profoundly optimistic about return to school, because you as leaders have always made it through in the past, and the past is the best predictor of the future. Thank you for sharing some time with us today.